The year was 1847, and the heart of Alabama lay heavy under a heat that never seemed to break, a suffocating heat that clung to skin and soul alike. Travelers who passed the Briarwood plantation spoke of it in low voices, as if afraid the towering oaks could overhear their trembling words. The land was too quiet, they said, the fields too still, the windows of the grand house too dark even in daylight. Something lived there, something old, cruel, and patient. And everyone who rode past felt it watching. When the new overseer arrived, he noticed the silence first. Enslaved workers avoided the main house with an almost supernatural dread, their eyes dropping whenever he asked questions. At night, he heard hushed murmurs drifting through the slave quarters, stories about the plantation lady and the strange sons she kept hidden from the world. Stories about births that no preacher ever blessed, and deaths that no doctor ever explained. He tried to dismiss them as superstition, the kind born from suffering. But then he saw the way the lady of the house looked at her boys. Her eyes lingered too long. Her touch lasted a moment too much. Her voice, calm and refined on the surface, carried an undertone that froze even the bravest man's blood. She ruled the plantation the way a serpent rules its nest, silently, fiercely, and with a hunger that had no bottom. The sons were pale, withdrawn, and strangely obedient, as if their wills had been carved away one command at a time. They followed their mother like ghosts trailing a lantern in the dark. And though they said little, the overseer could see the fear beneath their blank expressions, a fear that grew sharper every time she called them inside. One night, while storm clouds gathered like bruises over the horizon, he discovered a hidden room beneath the house. The ledgers inside were filled with names, dates, and unsettling notes about lineage, pairings, and bloodlines. He felt the air grow colder around him as he flipped through the pages, each entry darker than the one before. Somewhere above, he heard footsteps, slow, deliberate, almost graceful, moving across the floorboards. He closed the ledger, but the house seemed to know he had read it. From that moment on, Briarwood Plantation felt alive, as if the walls themselves were whispering warnings he could not ignore. And then the screaming began. A sound so raw, so full of terror and brokenness, that it traveled through the night like a curse carried on the wind. The overseer froze, realizing the stories weren't stories at all. They were warnings. And now he was part of the secret no outsider was ever meant to know. When the new overseer arrived at Briarwood Plantation, he expected the usual hardships that came with managing southern land in the 1800s, but nothing prepared him for the heavy, unnatural silence that greeted him the moment he stepped off his horse. Plantations were rarely quiet places. There was always movement, the distant thud of tools, the rustle of workers in the fields, the chatter of daily life struggling to survive under harsh conditions. Here, though, it felt as if the air itself was holding its breath. The enslaved workers moved with rigid caution, never straying near the main house, and every time he tried to engage them in simple introductions, their eyes flicked nervously toward the mansion's looming structure, as if afraid it would hear them speak. From the very first hour, he sensed that fear ruled this land far more effectively than any whip or overseer ever could. His arrival had not been met with welcome, not even from the plantation lady herself, who stood at the top of the steps watching him with a smile that felt carved rather than earned, a smile that did not reach her eyes. Those eyes were cold and assessing, as if she were measuring his usefulness rather than greeting him. There was an eerie stillness to her presence, a polished elegance masking something he could not yet name. She spoke politely, her words smooth and controlled, but beneath her calm tone, he sensed a quiet authority that seemed absolute. As she guided him through the grounds, he noticed that no worker dared cross her path. They lowered their heads, their steps quickening, their shoulders stiffening whenever she passed. It was not the typical fear of punishment, it was deeper, almost spiritual, as though her gaze alone carried a kind of power that drained the courage from their bones. At night, the silence grew heavier. The overseer, still new to the plantation's rhythm, found himself unable to sleep as he listened to the strange quiet that wrapped around the house. Occasionally, he thought he heard soft footsteps or faint murmurs carried by the wind, but whenever he stepped outside to look, the grounds were empty, the darkness swallowing everything beyond the lantern's reach. He began to sense that the plantation carried a secret, one the workers were terrified to speak of. Their glances shared a warning he could not yet understand. And even though he had only just arrived, He felt a presence watching him from the mansion's upper windows, a presence that made the hairs rise on the back of his neck, as though the house itself were studying him, waiting to see whether he would discover what lay hidden beneath its walls. Whispers were the true language of Briarwood Plantation, a fragile thread of truth passed quietly from one enslaved soul to another under the cover of night. The overseer first noticed these murmurs during his second week, when he walked past the slave quarters after dusk and caught fragments of conversations that stopped the moment his shadow crossed the doorway. The voices had been trembling, almost frantic, as if the speakers were clinging to a secret that burned too hot to hold yet was too dangerous to release. He pretended not to notice, but the sudden silence that followed him felt louder than any words they might have spoken. It was clear that something was being hidden, something the workers were terrified might reach the wrong ears. The overseer had managed plantations before. He knew the sound of ordinary complaints, of pain, of exhaustion. This was different. This was the sound of people trying to protect each other from a truth that could destroy them if spoken aloud. He began to observe them more closely. During the day, they avoided discussing the past, their families, or anything that might hint at the plantation's history. When he asked harmless questions about how long someone had been working the fields, the worker would stiffen, mouth trembling as though weighing the risk of answering. Some would lower their gaze and mutter only a year or two, though their hands and faces carried the marks of decades. Others simply walked away, murmuring apologies with fear thick in their voices. None of this made sense to him. People usually found comfort in sharing their stories, but here every memory seemed to carry a shadow, and every shadow traced back to the main house. The strangest whispers were about the children. Not all of them, just the ones who had been born in the big house, the ones who lived too close to the plantation lady's watchful eyes. The enslaved workers never discussed those children in daylight, but at night he heard hints of tragedy disguised as cautionary tales. Someone would mention babies who had no recognized father, or mothers who wept silently after giving birth, or strange changes in the sons who were raised under the lady's roof. The overseer caught fragments like broken pieces of a puzzle, not natural, not right, born wrong, born scared, born from the house, not from God. Each whispered phrase sent a chill down his spine. He began to sense that these stories weren't just rumors born from suffering but warnings disguised as folklore. The workers weren't gossiping, they were trying to protect themselves from a truth they knew far too well. A truth they believed the overseer was better off never learning. But their fear only deepened his curiosity, and with every passing night, the whispers grew harder to ignore, calling him toward a secret that had been buried at Briarwood long before he arrived. The plantation lady carried herself with the kind of poise that could make a stranger mistake her for a woman of grace, but anyone who spent more than a moment in her presence sensed an unsettling edge beneath the polished exterior. She spoke with refinement, walked with elegance, and maintained the careful dignity expected of a southern woman of status, yet everything about her felt rehearsed, like a performance perfected over years of suppressing something darker beneath the surface. Her voice was calm and cool, her posture rigidly flawless, but her eyes betrayed an obsession that ran deeper than pride. When she talked about Briarwood's history, she lingered too long on topics of lineage, legacy, and blood. She spoke of family lines the way a scientist speaks of specimens, with a disturbing fascination that made the overseer's stomach tighten even before he fully understood the implications. He first noticed this unsettling focus when she guided him through the portrait hall, a long corridor filled with paintings of ancestors. She described each forebear not with affection or nostalgia, but with an almost clinical coldness, noting their features, their traits, their strong lines, as she called them. Her tone softened only when she referred to her own children, but not in the way most mothers do. Instead of sharing stories of their childhood or kindnesses, she talked about their inheritance, the way their faces matched hers in certain angles, the purity of their lineage, the unmistakable merging of their blood. The overseer felt a prick of discomfort, unsure why her words felt wrong, yet instinctively sensing something distorted in her view of motherhood. Her obsession revealed itself in other ways too. She monitored her sons with a strictness that bordered on tyrannical, rarely letting them wander far from the main house and scrutinizing every interaction they had with the people around them. She seemed to watch them not out of love but out of ownership, as though they were prized possessions rather than living, breathing boys with their own desires. At meals, She corrected the slightest misstep with the precision of someone shaping clay, molding them into the image she wanted rather than allowing them to grow on their own. Her sons sat quietly, avoiding eye contact, their bodies tense in a way that suggested years of emotional confinement. The overseer noticed, too, how she reacted to the enslaved women who worked closest to the house. She evaluated them with the same invasive gaze she used on her sons, paying particular attention to their appearance, their health, and even their mannerisms. It was as if she were studying them for compatibility, judging them not as human beings but as components in a design only she understood. Every time she passed one of these women, they stiffened as if bracing for something inevitable. Her presence alone seemed to drain the color from their faces, and though the overseer did not yet understand why, he could feel the tension ripple through the air like an invisible warning. What unsettled him most was the unmistakable conviction behind her actions. She didn't behave like someone committing cruelty, she behaved like someone fulfilling a duty shaped by a belief system entirely her own. In her mind, she wasn't acting out of malice but out of purpose, a purpose rooted in an obsession with blood that no outsider could comprehend until it was far too late. Her sons were the first true evidence that something inside Briarwood had gone deeply, unnervingly wrong. They were young men old enough to work a field, yet they carried themselves with the timidity of boys who had never been allowed to grow into their own skin. Their steps were soft, hesitant, and their voices rarely rose above a murmur, as if they feared their own words might offend the walls that surrounded them. The overseer noticed early on that they barely spoke to anyone, not even to each other, except when directly instructed by their mother. Their lives seemed to orbit around her, pulled in by a force stronger than affection, something more like an invisible chain wrapped tightly around their minds. At first, the overseer assumed they were simply sheltered, raised in the suffocating comfort that wealthy families sometimes imposed on their children. But the more time he spent observing them, the clearer it became that what they suffered wasn't mere overprotection, it was a carefully engineered isolation. They had grown up cut off from the world, denied contact with anyone who might challenge their mother's control or expose them to a life beyond the plantation's borders. They administered chores only within the house, not in the fields, and even then under her watchful eye. When they walked past the enslaved workers, they did so with a mixture of curiosity and dread, as though they'd been taught conflicting lessons about the humanity of the people around them. Confusion and fear lived behind their eyes like twin shadows they had never been allowed to question. The older son, tall and long-limbed, carried a nervous twitch in his hands, always fidgeting with the hem of his shirt or the chain of his pocket watch. He avoided direct gaze, flinching at sudden noises as though conditioned to anticipate punishment. The younger son was softer in demeanor, his shoulders hunched inward, his expression distant, like someone living inside a world no one else could see. When their mother spoke to them, they responded instantly, with an accuracy that felt rehearsed rather than natural. She didn't have to raise her voice, her presence alone was enough to command obedience. The overseer once caught a moment between the brothers when they thought no one was watching. They stood behind the garden hedges, whispering intensely, their faces pale with a desperation that didn't match their quiet lives. Whatever they were discussing died the moment they sensed his approach, replaced instantly by the same hollow look they always wore in their mother's presence. He couldn't shake the feeling that they were prisoners of her design, shaped by years of manipulation that blurred the line between loyalty and fear. What haunted him most was not their silence but the sense that they had been raised for a purpose. They were not simply her children, they were components of a plan she had spent years perfecting. A plan that required obedience. A plan that demanded their minds, their wills, and perhaps something far more horrifying, something the overseer was only beginning to understand as he watched their mother tighten her grip on them with every passing day. The discovery of the hidden basement chamber happened by accident, yet the overseer would later swear that the house itself had guided him there, as if it were tired of carrying the burden alone. He had been inspecting the lower hallways after hearing what he thought were footsteps beneath the floorboards. The sound was faint, almost like muffled pacing, but persistent enough to draw him toward the far end of the corridor where the wood felt colder under his touch. A draft seeped through the cracks of the wall, unusual for a house built so tightly, and when he pressed his palm against the wainscoting, he felt a subtle vibration that made his skin crawl. Something was behind it, something that wasn't meant to be found. It took him several minutes to discover the latch cleverly concealed beneath a decorative carving. The panel slid open with a creak that seemed too loud in the suffocating quiet, revealing a narrow staircase descending into darkness. The air that drifted up was stale, tinged with the faint scent of ink, mildew, and something else he couldn't identify, something metallic and old. He lit a lantern and stepped down, each tread groaning under his weight as though protesting the intrusion. The deeper he went, the more oppressive the air became, thick with the weight of secrets long buried. At the bottom of the stairs, the lantern revealed a room far larger than he expected, a chamber carved out of the foundations, hidden from every blueprint and every servant's memory. Shelves lined the walls, overflowing with ledgers bound in cracked leather. Papers lay scattered across a long wooden table, and the ink bottles beside them were dried into dark crusts. He picked up one of the ledgers, brushing off decades of dust, and felt a pulse of dread before he even opened it. Something instinctual warned him that these pages contained the heart of Briarwood's sickness. The first entries were simple records of births and pairings, nothing unusual for a plantation of its size. But the further he turned, the stranger the notes became. Names were listed without fathers, or with symbols instead of identities. In some entries, the same mother appeared again and again, her childbirth spaced with unnatural precision. Margins contained strange instructions about maintaining strong lines and preserving houseborn traits. The overseer felt the temperature drop as he flipped through the ledgers, the words growing colder, more calculated, more deliberate in their purpose. These weren't normal plantation records, they were designs, experiments, blueprints of something horrifying that had been carefully orchestrated for years. He noticed drawings pinned to the walls, sketches of faces, family branches, and annotations tying certain children together through the plantation lady's lineage. The realization hit him slowly, like a sickness crawling up his spine. These weren't the records of a business. They were the records of a legacy built on twisted manipulation of bloodlines. Every line inked on those pages represented a life shaped by her design. He stepped back from the table, his breath shallow, his pulse racing, as the truth pressed down on him with suffocating certainty. The house had been hiding more than just secrets. It had been hiding intent. And now that he had seen it, the walls felt alive around him, as if warning him that there was no turning back from what he had uncovered. The illness began quietly, almost imperceptibly, as if it were another shadow cast by the oppressive atmosphere of Briarwood Plantation. At first, the overseer noticed only small changes in the enslaved women who worked nearest to the house, a lingering fatigue, trembling hands, eyes that seemed to hold a deeper strain than usual. These women had always borne the weight of exhaustion, but this was something different, something that seemed to drain them from the inside out. They moved slowly, clutching their stomachs or leaning against walls when they thought no one was watching. Their breaths were shallow, their voices softer, as though speaking too loudly might worsen whatever ailment clung to them. When he asked what troubled them, they shook their heads quickly, insisting they were fine, though fear flickered behind their eyes like a candle struggling to stay lit. Within a week, the sickness grew more pronounced. Some women collapsed in the fields, others struggled to stand after bending down to pick cotton, and still others seemed to be fighting waves of pain they refused to describe. Their fear of speaking the truth seemed stronger than the agony itself. The plantation doctor, summoned reluctantly by the lady of the house, gave indifferent diagnoses and quick assurances that the women were merely overworked. He barely touched them, barely looked them in the eye, jotting down notes in a stiff, hurried hand before departing as fast as he could. But the overseer noticed his pale face and unsteady steps as he left the main house. Whatever he saw unsettled him enough that he never stayed longer than necessary. By the second week, the overseer began to see a pattern that tightened his chest with dread. The illness affected only specific women, the same ones whose names he had seen repeatedly in the ledgers in the hidden chamber. Mothers who had given birth more times than nature should ever have demanded. Women who lived closest to the big house, who were summoned at odd hours and returned pale and shaking. Their condition wasn't random. It followed a rhythm too precise to be coincidence, like the echo of something orchestrated deliberately over time. He approached one of the older women, someone who had always carried an air of resilience, but even she seemed frayed at the edges. When he asked gently what was happening, she looked at him with hollow eyes and whispered that he must not ask questions. The house had ears. The lady had plans. And the women, she said in a trembling voice, were paying the price for something too terrible to name. Before she could say more, another worker hurried her away, shaking her head in silent warning. The overseer began to feel the full terror of the truth settling over him. The illness wasn't natural. It was the result of years of manipulation, years of forced roles and broken bodies, years of a twisted lineage the plantation lady had been constructing behind closed doors. And now the women were suffering the consequences of being caught in the center of an experiment that treated human lives as tools to shape her vision. Each pained face, each trembling hand, each silent tear became another sign that Briarwood's darkest secret wasn't just hidden, it was still unfolding, still claiming victims, still tightening its grip on everyone trapped within the plantation's cursed boundaries. The escape attempt began with the kind of quiet desperation that had been building like pressure beneath the plantation's surface for years. Among the enslaved women, there was one young, sharp-eyed, and braver than most, who had seen enough to understand the true danger lurking inside the main house. She had witnessed things no one should witness, heard conversations that were never meant for her ears, and endured moments that left her trembling long after they passed. Unlike the others, she did not bury these truths under fear. She carried them like burning coals, each day stoking the resolve that one day she would run. She knew what the illness meant, she knew why certain women were chosen and summoned, and she knew that if she didn't leave soon, she would become the next name written in the ledgers hidden beneath the floorboards. It was just past midnight on a night when the fog rolled across the fields so thickly it muffled even the crickets. The air was cool enough to hide her breath, and the clouds swallowed the moon, turning the world into a shadowy maze that she prayed would work in her favor. She slipped from her cabin barefoot, carrying nothing but the clothes on her back and the faint hope that somewhere beyond the tree line lay freedom, or at the very least, a life not ruled by the plantation lady's monstrous vision. She moved with practiced silence, her heart pounding like a drum inside her ribs as she crossed the open yard. Every creak of wood, every distant rustle made her flinch, but she kept moving, the weight of her secret propelling her forward. She had almost reached the tree line when a lantern flared to life behind her, flooding the yard with a circle of harsh yellow light. A man's shout split the darkness. Then another. Dogs were unleashed, their barks tearing through the fog with violent urgency. Panic surged through her, and she ran harder, her feet slapping against the damp earth, her breath coming out in ragged gasps. She made it halfway into the woods before the hounds caught her scent. Their snarls grew louder, closer, until one lunged at her skirt and dragged her to the ground. She screamed, kicking wildly, scrambling for anything to hold on to. Within moments, the men were upon her, hauling her back through the trees as she kicked and twisted, leaving streaks in the dirt where her heels dug in. The plantation lady watched her return from the veranda, her face composed but her eyes glittering with a cold satisfaction. The overseer, who had witnessed the scene from a distance, felt a sickness crawl through him that no illness could rival. The woman's desperate attempt had confirmed the truth he feared most. No one fled from Briarwood simply because they were mistreated. They fled because the house demanded things from them that no human soul should ever be asked to endure. And the lady, standing tall and silent beneath the moonless sky, looked less like a grieving mistress and more like the architect of something unspeakable, something she would protect at any cost, even if it meant hunting down the very people whose suffering fueled her darkest obsession. When the fugitive woman was dragged back through the gates of Briarwood, her wrists bound and her face streaked with dirt and tears, the entire plantation seemed to hold its breath. The overseer watched as the men forced her to her knees before the main house, and though she trembled violently, she did not cry out. Her silence unsettled him more than any scream could have. It was the silence of someone who knew that whatever awaited her inside was worse than anything she had endured in the woods. The enslaved workers who witnessed her return quickly turned away, their expressions tightening as if the very act of looking might draw punishment down upon them too. But the overseer noticed something else, glances exchanged between the workers, brief and haunted, that suggested they already knew what her fate would be, and that no one who entered the big house under such circumstances ever came out unchanged. The plantation lady descended the steps with the same eerie calm she carried in every moment. She approached the captured woman not with outrage or disgust, but with a chilling curiosity, almost as if studying a specimen rather than addressing a human being. Her sons stood behind her, their shoulders stiff, their faces pale in the lamplight. The overseer saw the fear etched into their expressions, the older boy tugging nervously at his sleeve, the younger one's hands clenched so tightly his knuckles were white. They were terrified, though not of the woman kneeling in the dirt. Their fear was fixed squarely on their mother, as though they knew what her mind was already shaping for them. The woman who had tried to flee lifted her eyes to the boys, and in that weary, shattered gaze was a message the overseer understood but could not fully decipher. It was an accusation, a plea, and a warning all at once. She had tried to escape not just the lady of the house, but the twisted command she imposed upon her sons, a command that the overseer now sensed had been forced upon countless women before her. When the lady spoke, her voice was soft, almost tender, but the undertone was colder than iron. She told her sons to take the woman inside. The boys hesitated, their bodies trembling, their breaths short and shallow. For a moment, the overseer thought they might refuse. But then their mother's eyes narrowed just slightly, a controlled, calculated motion, and the boys moved forward, their obedience automatic and sickeningly conditioned. The woman screamed only once, a raw, broken sound as the boys took her arms. But the scream wasn't for herself. It was for them. For the sons who had been raised not as children, but as tools in their mother's deranged vision. The overseer saw it clearly now in the way they avoided looking at each other, in the way their hands shook as they carried out her command. They weren't monsters. They were victims, trapped in a web spun long before they were old enough to understand what they were being molded into. Their mother had made sure of that, tightening her grip on their minds and wills until their obedience became indistinguishable from fear. As the woman was dragged into the house, the overseer realized with crushing clarity that the plantation lady's power did not rest in the records hidden beneath the floorboards or the secrets locked in whispered stories. It rested in her sons, reshaped by years of manipulation into instruments of her grotesque purpose. And now that he had seen the truth in their haunted eyes, he understood the full horror of Briarwood. The danger wasn't just in what the lady had done. It was in what she had raised. Here is the 450-word explanation for key point number 9, with ***, no subheadings and no ending sentence ***. Key point number 9 explores how the emotional strain within the family did not stay hidden behind closed doors but began to seep into their interactions with the broader community, revealing fractures that outsiders could sense even when they did not fully understand the source. As rumors slowly circulated, neighbors noticed subtle changes, hesitations in speech, guarded glances, and an unspoken tension that hovered in the air whenever the family appeared in public. This point emphasizes that isolation does not only occur physically, it can take the form of emotional withdrawal, a self-protective mechanism that deepens the divide between a troubled family and the world around them. The family's attempts to mask their internal turmoil were undermined by the growing unpredictability of their behavior, which became evident in moments of irritability, sudden absences, or unusual defensiveness. Even small incidents became magnified, such as quiet arguments overheard at markets or sidelong looks exchanged at community gatherings. People sensed something was deeply wrong, though they lacked the context to interpret it accurately. This ambiguity created an atmosphere where assumptions flourished, and whispered conversations fed into the making of a shadowy reputation that eventually surrounded the family. The point also highlights how the emotional burden affected the younger members most visibly. Their silence, withdrawn demeanor, and reluctance to participate in social activities made others uncomfortable, reinforcing the idea that something troubling lingered behind their closed doors. Teachers, neighbors, and acquaintances found it increasingly difficult to connect with them, as if the children carried a weight they could not name, yet could not escape. Their emotional exhaustion made them appear older than their age, and the struggles they endured at home followed them into everyday interactions. Whether it was their unusually distant expressions or their sudden emotional outbursts, the signs of internal conflict slipped into the open despite their efforts to remain unnoticed. This key point further explains how the emotional strain created a cycle, one where avoidance and secrecy only intensified suspicion, and suspicion deepened the family's need to withdraw further. Their shrinking presence in the community became both a symptom and a cause of growing mistrust. The more they retreated, the more people talked, and the more they talked, the more the family felt the pressure of eyes watching them. Over time, what began as subtle emotional stress developed into a cloud of unease that the family could no longer hide. Their emotional instability, shaped by years of internal hardship, made the community view them as different, strange, or troubled, even though few understood the true reasons behind their behavior. Here is the 450-word explanation for key point number 10, with ***, no subheadings and no ending sentence ***. Key point number 10 focuses on the final unraveling of the family's hidden truth and how years of secrecy, emotional strain, and generational trauma ultimately led to a moment where everything could no longer be contained. This point emphasizes that buried stories, no matter how deeply hidden, have a way of resurfacing when the pressure becomes unbearable. The cracks that had been forming for years finally widened to the point where silence could not hold them together. Whether it was an unexpected confession, a slip of the tongue, or an outsider noticing something that did not add up, the truth emerged in a way that forced the family to confront what they spent years trying to hide. The weight of their past, shaped by choices made long before some of them were even born, began to bear down heavily, and the emotional exhaustion made secrecy impossible to maintain. The atmosphere inside the household shifted as fear and guilt turned into resignation, and the individuals who once worked tirelessly to protect their family name found themselves unable to keep pretending. This point explains that when the truth came to light, it did not explode outward in dramatic chaos but unfolded slowly, like a series of realizations spreading from one person to another. Neighbors, relatives, and community members pieced together fragments, and quiet suspicions grew into undeniable awareness. Conversations that once took place behind closed doors now happened openly, and people began connecting details that previously seemed insignificant. What had been dismissed as odd behavior or misfortune now appeared to be part of a much darker and more complicated history. Those who had known the family for years reacted with a mixture of shock, pity, and discomfort, unsure whether to feel sympathy for the suffering that caused the secrecy or judgment for the choices that allowed it to persist for so long. Meanwhile, the younger family members, who had lived their lives carrying a weight they never understood, suddenly found clarity in places where confusion had once existed. The point also highlights how the exposure of the truth brought a strange sense of relief. Even though the fallout was painful, the silence that had suffocated the family for generations finally broke. For some, this revelation marked the beginning of healing, as acknowledging the past allowed them to understand their own emotional wounds. For others, it triggered anger and resentment, fueled by the belief that they had been denied the chance for a better life because of choices and secrets not their own. Yet in the midst of the turmoil, the collapsing of silence created space for change, even if that change came at the cost of confronting uncomfortable realities they had avoided for so long.